Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and today for Book Trek 2021, we're going to be talking about Star Trek, the motion picture novelization by Gene Roddenberry. Now, before we talk about this book, I think there's some context that needs to be provided to, so- to really maybe properly appreciate this book and where it fits into the Star Trek literature spectrum. Uh, to try and remember that Star Trek, the original series, came out in the late 60s. And I think it was 1966 and 1969. Got canceled after the third season. And then for about 10 years, there's no live Star Trek on television. So the Star Trek fan base, all right, is kind of keeping things going largely on their own in certain ways. We have James Blish, an author, who is adapting Star Trek episodes and scripts, all right, into these numbered Star Trek books. Here's just one example. He would take the teleplays of the episodes and he would make short stories out of them. So fans who, the show went into syndication, and of course it had, oh, sorry, got an obnoxiously large car going by. They could revisit those episodes. Of course, in a day when you didn't have Netflix and on-demand television. There was also demand for some more original Star Trek content. So, in addition to that, James Blish also wrote the first original Star Trek novel, which is Spock Must Die. I believe it came out in 1970. But of course, the fan base was hungry for more Star Trek, and they were writing their own fiction. So, fan fiction exploded during this time. Some of it was collected into works like this, Star Trek: The New Voyages. Pretty, I love that cover. Some of the artwork on these books is pretty amazing. And these are essentially, this is fan fiction that has been collected, all right, by, in this case, Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth, who also wrote their own original Star Trek novels, one of them being The Price of the Phoenix, which I have not read yet. I haven't read Spock Must Die yet either, but I'm going to try to get to that one, I think, in the coming week. You also had adaptations of the animated series, which came out in the 70s, and which some of the stories and writing was actually genuinely good on that cartoon. However, the coloring wasn't always very good. I think they actually had a colorblind colorist at times. Nevertheless, you had Alan Dean Foster, who was adapting the cartoons into short stories, and these came out as Star Trek logs. All right, so in here we have log 8. Alan Dean Foster also ends up writing the story for what would be Star Trek: The Motion Picture. At first in the 70s, they were thinking about doing Star Trek Phase 2, which was going to be another show. And plans kept on changing, and then eventually we have the film that comes out in 1979. So he comes fostering some of the story. You have the screenplay by Harold Livingston, and then Roddenberry, okay, the great bird of the galaxy himself, there he is right there, he writes the novelization of the film. And that's what we're going to focus on today. The film itself has kind of a mixed reputation. I think non-Star Trek fans consider it quite boring. I think even some Star Trek fans I know also consider it boring. I happen to like it. There are some parts that are a little bit too drawn out, a little bit too slow. I will entirely admit that. But otherwise, I think it's a solid sci-fi story, a solid Star Trek story. In many ways, it's kind of a rehash or retelling of the original series episode, The Changeling, where you have the Nomad probe that becomes sentient and starts wreaking havoc on the Enterprise. In this case, we have this large cloud that's on its way to Earth. I think it's like 8 AUs long or something like that, and it has a probe that essentially takes over Ilea. She is a Deltan extraterrestrial who is destroyed and then copied by this thing that ends up being known as V'ger. And V'ger is on its way back to Earth to find and report back to the creator. And they're trying to figure out what that is. And if they can't figure it out, of course, V'ger will end up destroying all life on Earth. Very Star Trek type story. And overall well told inside this. This is a book that takes place about, almost 10 years after the series ended. The original 5-year mission of Star Trek, the original series. Which again, we only saw 3 years of because of the cancellation. And time's passed in between that and this story. So the crew, Kirk, McCoy, Spock, and the rest, they've been scattered. They've kind of gone their own way. Kirk has become an admiral. Spock is going through the Kolinar, a ritual to try and purge himself of all of his human emotions. McCoy is, I don't know, dressing like a disco king, it seems, at least according to the way he looks on the in the movie when he returns back to the ship. So this is an estranged crew of old friends who are learning once again to be friends. And that's pretty well done with this. Roddenberry's story, his version of things, as they all assemble back onto the Enterprise, it moves quite swiftly, which is nice. I mean, this is a pretty fast read, actually, but sometimes it's a little bit too fast. We learn, in the beginning of the movie, there's a transporter accident where these two individuals who are going to be beamed aboard, there's a malfunction, and they kind of come out of this biomass blob, and they die. Well, in this, we find out that Kirk knew one of them intimately for like a year. And he kind of shakes off pretty quickly on this. There's a kind of a throwaway line where he talks about, well, I need to focus on the mission. I can't let this bother me right now. And then he just never thinks about it again. And even at the end of the book, after they've saved the Earth, they just kind of go carousing and go shooting off into space for a new adventure and kind of forget about all these, deaths and all the things that they've seen. And Roddenberry's writing is pretty decent in this, actually. At one point, he talks about the thrumming of the Enterprise's engines as tightly leashed thunder, which I thought was a pretty great phrase. There are some other things that are curious about his version of this story. This is a surprisingly sexualized book. Maybe it's just a product of the 1970s. We know Roddenberry, of course, himself was, fond of the ladies. But Ilea, you can kind of barely see her face here, a Deltan. It's not really dealt with in the movie at all, but in this, it's rammed into your head that Deltans release pheromones that make them almost virtually irresistible to the opposite sex. And there are many times when Kirk himself is pondering this, and at one point with the probe, he's wondering if his own sexual skills, it seems, might be able to unlock this probe, maybe save the Earth. It's very bizarre. And we have at a time where Sulu is hiding an awkward appendage when she's near and he has to stand up, which is awkward to read itself. And it just kind of pervades this entire thing. And I'm not saying it's in a bad way, but I think there's certainly, Roddenberry's vision of the future was one in which sexuality would have been open, and openly discussed and not hidden and not to be, ashamed of. But there's also seems to be, the future being a place of sexual availability and access, which kind of comes across as a little bit, awkward at times, I think, in some of these. But anyway, I would recommend this, even if you have read even if you have seen the motion picture. I do think this is worth seeking out and reading, because it does also mark a major shift in Star Trek fiction as it's published. The stuff that was published by, previously, like this, Steve Donahue made a pretty great video in his Star Trek Starter Kit where he talks about the pre-lawyer age of Star Trek and the post-lawyer age. This is a little bit of a Wild West. This stuff is highly, I'm not saying this volume in particular, I haven't read this one, but there was a lot of highly sexualized stories. And it's kind of funny. Roddenberry actually he addresses that at one point. He addresses the slash fiction that had erupted in the 70s, fan fiction in which Kirk and Spock are intimately and sexually involved. And there's a pretty funny footnote that is supposed to be from Kirk himself, because part of the way that this is written is that Roddenberry is like a chronicler, and Kirk is available to give insight. And he has a pretty funny line. I don't know if I can find it. I know it's somewhere towards the beginning. Oh yeah, about that sexual rumor between Spock and Kirk. This is what Kirk says. I was never aware of this lover's rumor, although I have been told that Spock encountered it several times. Apparently, he had always dismissed it with his characteristic lifting of his right eyebrow, which usually connoted some combination of surprise, disbelief, and/or annoyance. As for myself, although I have no moral or other objections to physical love in any of its many earthly, alien, and mixed forms, I have always found my best gratification in that creature, woman. Also, I would dislike being thought of as so foolish that I would select a love partner who came into sexual heat only once every 7 years. Which, if you know about Ponfar, you know what he's referring to there. And this is kind of like the beginning of the lawyer version of Star Trek fiction, which we have had ever since. So in certain ways, this is kind of like the first official Star Trek novel. Even though Spock Must Die was the first original one, it's kind of, it's not considered a part really of Star Trek canon. None of the fiction is, but you can kind of pretend with some of these things. This is definitely not. But this one, of course, the film is canon. But this begins the lawyer phase, as far as I understand, of Star Trek fiction. So this is not a bad place to start if somebody wanted to jump in and give Star Trek fiction a try. And I think, that footnote of Kirk is kind of addressing some of that over-sexualized slash fiction, etc., that in this new official version of things that we're going to be released in novelization, there wouldn't be any of that sort of writing. Kirk and Spock finding their love affair no longer unrequited. So anyway, those are just some of the thoughts on Star Trek the Motion Picture novelization by Gene Roddenberry, published in 1979, along with the same year that the film was released. And yeah, so I do recommend this one, even with all those factors to be considered. All right, so thank you, BookTube.